Okay. Sorry, just dosing the coffee. So yeah, so just kind of talking about the horror of reckoning with the materialization of our environmental situation, like Times Square and orange smoke, right? And I was kind of drawing the arc in like the two critical functions of the mind, of consciousness. And this is all, said before the recording. There's the tool utilization or the understanding of a system or the grasping of a thing. But then there's, on the other half, the emissary side of master and his emissary, or sorry, the master side of master and his emissary, the understanding of what's available, right? And the question there is, how do we broaden what people view as available to them? How do we knock off the walls of their perception, right? And so there's two ways. And the first, and Vervaeke really tries to define these terms very rigorously, very carefully. And the first one is the sense of awe. The sense of awe is a positive expansion of possibility, like a recognition that more exists and is available than one had ever thought, one had ever understood. So it allows somebody, the sense of awe allows people deeper insight into the kind of nomological system they're a part of, the steps, the availabilities, the affordances, the opportunities. It's like, you're walking along a mountain and then all of a sudden you find a cave.
Join in a moment.
Oh, hey, Jason. Or Darren. Anyway, all of a sudden you find a cave and you realize that the mountain has more faces than you ever thought, and some of them contain mystery, which is really interesting. And you have that availability to explore that mystery. That's that sense of awe. But there's an expansion of the possibilities in a way that decoheres you from reality. There's an expansion of what could be that you don't have a grip on how to manipulate it. It casts you into an ocean of being unmoored and adrift, and you don't have a way to grapple with it. And that's most technically defined as horror. An expansion of reality in a way that you decohere from it. And so, as I kind of just think about people, we talked last call a little bit about, 2 weeks ago, actually, when I was on, about how people have changed a bit. And I think that there's this kind of subtle fear linked to that sense of horror, that their ability to safely navigate this world, their understanding of the world has expanded in a way that decoheres them from their agency, which is really interesting.
Mm-hmm. How do you explain the lack of curiosity in general? Do you have any thoughts on that in your experience, just meeting people?
Yeah. Well, my first impulse is it's the fear response. My first reaction is it's very well explained by squares and boxes and straight lines. This model of awe and horror, and how they allow people to kind of expand their understanding of the world around them, either in a way that they can navigate and feel safe in, or a way that makes them feel listless and potentially put into a dangerous situation. That people cling to a closed-mindedness. They run away from curiosity because it allows them to cling to an affordance, to an opportunity, to something they believe will create safety for them. If that makes sense. Like the lack of curiosity is to say that, I know that manipulating this job, this body, this economy in this particular way accords with my beliefs of what will keep me safe. A person, there's like a discussion on the internet about the patriarch, for example, will cling to facts and knowledge from science because that has been, proven by any credible parties around them to be a safe way to avoid the fear of not knowing, the fear of uncertainty.
Right. So is that sense of safety then related to a sense of control and therefore
Yeah.
the left hemisphere of the brain?
Absolutely. In my view.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But of course I remain curious about that. How do you see it? I mean, would you like to expand on that or?
Yeah, well, then for me, the question arises as to what role the sense of control actually should play in our approach or any approach to the future or our current situation. In other words, like, should we abandon control entirely? How do you navigate that line?
Yeah, it's
Is
such a good
control the
question.
enemy? Is that...
Well, this is probably no surprise, but I think so much of it might depend on, what is the goal? What is the we? What is the particulars of the situation, right? And I don't say that just to try to dissolve the question into meaninglessness, but I think that those things really do matter, But I think one thing that's so important is, there's two sides to this. Either like trying to create an environment where there is not that fear of participation, right? This is kind of like, this is the downside of disciplinarianism, is it locks people into this kind of rigid mindset based on their fear of the repercussion of venturing away from it, right? But then the flip side of the coin of creating an environment where there is kind of a felt sense of safety, the flip side of that is creating a person who's not afraid of fear, right? Like what is it that truly can hurt you as an awareness? Just getting people to be mature enough to not be so fearful. I think those are two sides of the coin in my response to your answer. Now, what do you think of those?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps a better question would be, is control mostly illusory? And so then, how would the illusory nature of that sense of control pertain to what we mean by fear in this context? Like, is fear then some kind of illusion? Are they both, like, how related are they?
I do think that it's just incredible to witness the manufacture of fear, right? So fear is obviously a relative term. Like I could be afraid all the time and never go outside. And I could also be afraid of screwing up my coffee right now by measuring the wrong amount, And those are wildly different things. But I think it's pretty clear that the modes of control, like the planting the idea of hell, of judgment, of prison, of patriarchy and parental control, all of these fears, I think, are very carefully cultivated by the system that we're kind of trapped in. I think that is a major avenue of its power over people, is to gin up and constantly produce fear.
Right, right.
Through education, through media, all these things. And so, I mean, in that context, yeah, it's very illusory by and large in so many ways. Even a lot of the topics we talk about collapse. People are very afraid of their lives and their possessions and threats to their possessions. And, and all about the worst case scenarios, I mean, they're not terribly well founded.
Yeah, but fear then, I think, generally circumscribes the horizon of your action. Like it actually serves to inhibit action. So is that inhibition related to what you were talking about earlier in terms of the emissary? So, in other words, is that inhibitory action pertinent to that form of consciousness, that kind of um, circumscribing, perimeterized consciousness? um, yeah, I wonder about that.
That's a really excellent thing to point out, and I think really fascinating. As you said, as I receive the way fear kind of creates the horizon of your opportunity or understanding. Um, I think that is brilliant. Um, when people grasp, I think I think fear interacts with that in multiple ways. That's for sure. Um, but I don't think it's the only detail. I think we're looking at a complex system, you know?
Mhm.
But yeah, did you want to expand on that? Was there more to say?
I guess I just wonder whether control and fear are two manifestations of the same kind of consciousness or the same impulse. And if like distinguishing them is somewhat artificial. Maybe, I mean, they could be, yeah, just different aspects of the same impulse. Because fear would essentially, I mean, fear essentially serves to circumscribe your actions, so it is a form of control. Maybe, whether self-imposed or otherwise, but yeah. When it comes to like what prevents people from, exploring their environment or entertaining certain possibilities or expanding their um, maybe just their intellectual or spiritual horizons. That's, I guess, where I was going with that because that's where we began. So,
Yeah, I think that's beautifully put. And I totally agree. At the very least, it seems that, fear creates the horizon or the container. And of course, control is the way in which someone operates within that container, so as not to break it and to accord with their fear, maybe among other motivations, but that's certainly a powerful one, right? Yeah, I like the way
yeah,
you've put it.
like most plans to me seem like total fiction. They just seem like works of fiction that people use to overcome the fear to act. But once they start acting, they
Wait,
abandon the
wait,
plan.
wait. Slow down on that one. That was much more momentous than it might have superficially appeared. I've never heard anything even vaguely resembling what you just said there. Let's just highlight the fuck out of that. Most plans, say that again. They seem to you a fiction.
Yeah. Yeah, most plans seem like works of fiction that people use as like a springboard to act
Wow,
out of fear.
that's
So it allows them to
incredible.
overcome this initial sense of fear, but then once they start acting, they abandon the plan entirely.
Okay. So here's the thing that I see about that blows my mind. Um, can I put this into words? I think I can. Uh, the consciousness with which they're evaluating the future is fundamentally fictitious to begin with. It's based on fictions.
Right.
And so, in order to overcome the gravity of those fictions in awareness and felt sensing, they have to compose a compensatory fiction, which is the plan. But then, once action begins, they have left the domain of fictions altogether. They're no longer in abstract bibbidi-bop, this piece fits into that piece, then you do this, then this happens. The moment they begin acting, they've changed contexts. And this is why the plan, certainly not in all cases, but in many cases, is just at that point irrelevant. Um, So in a sense, what you were saying, and I don't think it's always true, but it's so useful to see where it is true. It's something like the plan bootstraps action against fear. And once action arises, the plan is often disregarded due to having left the context in which fear is an operant feature of the interior felt sense of what's happening. In a sense, fear is kind of the opposite of acting.
Right. Yep.
And
I
part
had
of
a
how... Sorry, go ahead.
oh, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No.
I wanted to say, I mean, I love what you're saying. Totally agree. And you know, I once had a director, boss of mine, in a very planning heavy field, and they said, you know, with a note of irony, a plan is just a list of things that never happen. They never happen that way. They never happen in that sort. You know, it was and I don't agree, but was it Churchill who said plans are nothing, planning is everything? I mean, I think I don't agree. And I think that's a really interesting colloquialism to parse out, because maybe the plans are nothing, but the fear is everything. But it's interesting how, you know, plans hedge or mine into the future to create that sense of security against fear of what the future may bring.
Right. And then the plan also supplies this sense of control, which itself is a kind of inhibition to action. So the plan actually prevents you from acting in a certain respect.
I've in my work, I've spent a lot of time planning, and a lot of time looking at different ways to plan. And you know, there's getting things done, and there's time blocking, and there's Kanban. You know, there's all this bullshit. And I just realized all the time I spent planning, of course, probably would have been more efficiently used just doing.
A lot of this conversation orbits something that I've been chewing on a lot lately, which is the triumvirate of vigilance, ambiguity, and prediction. But I want to distinguish, I want to use an analogy to create a boundary, or to create a sense of a boundary. I am at the pool, it is a hot day. I put my foot in the water, it is fucking cold. I can tell it's gonna suck to get in the water. But I want to get in the water because it's hot out here. And I want to play in the water with the other people. But I have become aware of the transition, right? The interim situation in which I will suffer. I'm going to have trouble breathing. I'm going to be doing that huffy breathing that where your body's like having cold shock and shit. I don't want to do it. So what do? While I'm up there thinking, right, I'm kind of frozen in the domain of action. While I'm up there thinking about what to do, in the domain of action, I'm not doing anything. I'm resisting the beginning of acting. So maybe I form a plan. And one of the dumb plans I used to form is I'm going to use the steps and just step down bit by bit into the water, slowly, slowly. When it reaches my waist, it's going to be really cold, and it's going to go to my belly, and on and on and on. And it was a stupid, you know, in my view. It's not that it didn't work, but that's what I used to do a lot. And
Just like to prolong your torture.
Exactly. I still do it to a degree. If I go to the ocean here is very fucking cold. I mean, it's not frigid, but it's, 47 or something. It's cold. It hurts. It actually hurts your bones when you get in it, especially if you're older. So these days, I sort of acclimate. I don't just dive all the way in, But diving all the way in is probably better. And so these are different styles of traversing the gap between thinking and action. One is go all into action immediately. The other is take it in a stepwise fashion. The latter is more like planning. The former is more like the abandonment of planning and the entering into action. But these have to do with vigilance, what we're paying attention to, right? Why we are paying attention to which things. Ambiguity, the stuff we don't know, the mysteriousness of the situation, the unknownness. And prediction, what do we think will happen? And the thing about action is it kind of lets go of that shit. It transforms vigilance from futures to now, largely, if not completely. It transforms ambiguity from thought to experience. And it transforms predictions, again, from the future to pretty much now. I mean, there's still some futuristic prediction going on. It's true. But most prediction, like once you're in action, the way you're paying attention to yourself and your relationship with situations and variables is different, radically different. It's a different kind of attention. It's partly the difference between abstraction and immediacy. And I'll stop blathering there. But yeah, that was just such an amazing, what an amazing insight that had never occurred to me before, that plans are mostly fiction. And certainly when compared to action, they are, because action is non-fictional. There's nothing fictional about doing it.
I like how you laid that out. I think, you know, a lot about the, you know, expectations and that kind of fear response.
Right.
You know, that's the back door, the Trojan horse, where it worms into your brain and paralyzes you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I kind of, well, many people, not you, you know, maybe me to some degree, but working on it. And one thing that I kind of was, well, two things I was reminded of. I remember a discussion some time back about time, you know, the scintillating timeline and the ways to kind of think about and consider time. And I think that overview of the scintillating path one takes, or even from inside of the journeyer, the kind of integral motion through time is really interesting here. But I also kind of think about, I don't know if it's in spinal catastrophism, but the way in which maybe our nervous system creates that delay, a delay in understanding. And I think that delay is in there, you know, can be magnified with fear as people are trained into fear and expectation of negative outcomes. I feel like that somehow goes wild, where they become paralyzed by this anticipation of, you know, negative outcomes, this terror. And in that way, people plan, and they plan obsessively, and they worry about the future obsessively. And it has something to do with that feedback that I think is really interesting. Don't know what.
I mean, in case it isn't obvious, whatever, and it probably is fairly obvious, but I'll mention it anyway. I think the fundamental root of fear is a misconception of death. And whatever can be done to ameliorate that misconception goes a long way to dissolving fear. Fear is like a kind of pressure, and I think it's ironically comprised. Because if you fear not having lived, right, if you fear dying in an unlived life, then you don't fear death, you fear the how to call it, the irreversible overprotection of physical safety. This is the difference between a friend of mine and I were talking yesterday, and he was talking about his experience. He's very interested in collapse and knows Schmachtenberger and Weinstein and a couple of those other people pretty closely, has worked with them. And the Metacrisis folks. And, he and I have had some long conversations about his perspectives and feelings personally about what's going on and what urgencies have arisen in our present moment. And he took a trip to the Amazon, and it was really mind-blowing for him. He spent some time in the Amazon rainforest with people who live in the forest. And he was shocked by the completely different way, like the absolutely different way in which they their value system, right? And yeah, they try to preserve life, but in a situation that's actually, where it's coming down to death may be happening. Unlike us, they're not trying to preserve their own life. They're trying to figure out which situation. This is actually something I added in. Under what conditions is it time for me to give up this life? Right? What's a worthy moment to stop protecting this and make it into a gift? So if a jaguar shows up, instead of the two guys trying to figure out, how to keep themselves alive, they're actually competing to determine who feeds themselves to the jaguar. Under some, circumstances, right? Where it's obvious somebody's going to go. And all I'm trying to say with that analogy, well, not all I'm trying to say, but part of what I'm trying to highlight is that there's a difference between living meaningfully and protecting the fuck out of something that will never become alive, right? Like, it's a conceptual gambit. I will protect, and it's partly, again, this other problem of projection of stable continuity from physical circumstances that we experience, right? Like the doorway to my bathroom is always the doorway to my bathroom. It's always there, doesn't change, doesn't move over time, just there. In dreaming, it might change. But we take that continuity in consciousness and we project it. We're trained to do this, otherwise we wouldn't do it so much. We're trained by our cultures to do this. But yeah, we project that continuity onto all phenomena, interiority, and so forth. And we also have entirely, I think, the wrong idea about death. Not that we want to just, suddenly sacrifice ourselves and, seek death or anything like that. It's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is our over-concerned avoidance of it is wrong-minded because it's based on a complete misunderstanding of what it is. We think we are the body, and therefore the body must be protected at all costs, because if the body goes away, I am gone. That can't be true. There's no chance of that being true. I understand how the fiction arose and how it gets propagated and why it's compelling and all of that kind of thing. There's no chance of that being true. This is particularly what the Eleusina mysteries in Greece were engineered to do away with. And part of the reason that there were sort of two primary features of the reason that they did away with this. The first, ironically, was that the extinguishing of the fear of death produces healing in the body, physical healing. So it's almost as if the fear of death is the cause of illness, in a sense. But it also produces liberation of the soul and intellect, without which you cannot have a democracy. So these two things, I think, were central to what was going on there. And, you know, lately, I can't say that I've understood or that I've integrated the things that I'm saying here. I'm still fucking scared of death. I am. I'm scared. And I'm, you know, viscerally scared of it with some degree of regularity in my experience. But I'm learning, right? It's dissolving slowly.
Well,
Yeah.
I think,
Go ahead,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
Yeah, I don't think it'd be healthy to completely abandon the visceral kind of fear, because if, you know, something tries to eat you and you just, you know, stood there and didn't do anything, that wouldn't be good, because if everyone was doing that, then everyone would just, you know, instantly die. But
Can I just push back against that for a second, please?
Well, hold on, I want to continue a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't think people should do the kind of dysfunctional, because my brother said this once, when I talked about how on the African savannah with hunter-gatherers, sometimes cats would eat them. And he immediately said, well, then they should gang up and go kill all the lions. And I'm like, well, that is the dysfunctional behavior right there. That is the entire problem with that kind of reaction. But the really unhealthy thing for people is having death haunt them like a phantasm all the time. The idea of it. That's the really bad part.
Yeah, I think this is what happens, and it usually starts in childhood. I think we don't have a natural understanding of death in childhood. It's imposed on us conceptually from outside.
Because clearly, you know, other animals are autonomous and resist being killed to the extent they can, but there's a difference between that and then building an army and burning down a forest and driving species to extinction. So,
I agree.
yeah, so I don't think that reaction is appropriate at all. What you said about the people living in the forest, that is a more healthy way to do it, where there is a time to live and there's a time to die, but there's no time to resist death for the rest of our lives, because that means we never lived, right?
Right.
I never
this
lived.
is the danger.
And
it's the danger of an unlived life. Yeah.
Yeah, and the thing that really makes me sad is a lot of people I know in my life, in my face-to-face life, are like this. They immediately cling to things like, oh, you should, you know, really work on your career and your social security. And I'm sitting here thinking, oh my God, they want me to pour concrete on my future self.
You're right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Create a casket of security.
Yeah. It's like
live all in the casket of security.
All this sort of, you know, strivings for beauty and stuff are completely gone in these people, it seems. And that just makes me grieve pretty hard.
Well, we live among a topology of persons, and some of the valleys are pretty low and some of the mountains are pretty high, right? But yeah, the people that we know, when they are so confused and so sort of committed to this confusion, it can be, a soft approach with those people often prevails over time. If you come to them and straight up go like, dude, you're out of your fucking mind, what are you thinking? They're going to bristle and double down on what they believe. But over time, they can be influenced, I find, generally. Even people who are very opinionated or ideologues, over time they can be influenced, especially if we're, friendly with them and stuff. But I just want to say something about the something ironic, and this doesn't obviate what you were saying, DB, about protecting one's life. It's just a weird experience I had. One day, a friend of mine were writing poems. Really brilliant young man. He's a great poet. He was the child of two amazing, famous poets, Anselm Berrigan. He and I were writing poems. It was a summer's day in my house. I have some crazy neighbors, drug dealers. They have two I had two gigantic pit bulls that would fight each other and like try to chew through anvils in their backyard all the time. And Anselm and I were out in front of my porch smoking a cigarette, and somehow the doors between the backyard and the front area were both open and unguarded. And the dogs came barreling down the stairs, focused on me with absolute death rage. I mean, their feet were skidding as they tried to run faster, slavering and snarling like fucking great white sharks on land sharks on steroids and meth. The rage in those animals was like nothing I had ever seen. This happened over the course of a few seconds. I was standing there with a cigarette leaning on my back foot. The dogs ran up to me, obviously intent on tearing me to shreds. I did nothing. There wasn't
Probably
anything
never
to
felt
do.
so alive.
There was nothing to do. I just sat there and kind of looked calmly at my death. Definitely right now is going to happen. And as the lead dog got close to me and it saw that I wasn't reacting, it had a moment of doubt. And it turned to the dog behind it for support. And that dog kind of looked at it like, yeah, bro, I don't know. And they both got sort of an embarrassed look on their face, and they turned around and trotted home.
That's amazing.
But what if
yeah.
I had run?
Oh, well, the thing is you did exactly the correct thing, because canines are coursing animals, which means they try to get their prey to run.
Mm-hmm.
So the last thing you want to do is turn your back on a canine and run.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that was really wise. That was really wise indeed.
But
They might
I just want to be
actually
clear.
bit you.
Yeah, I just want to be clear. I take no credit for the wisdom. I take no credit for the fact I survived. It was an accidental non-reaction to a situation, and it also involved the fact that I was being observed by the extremely calm Anselm Berrigan. So it wasn't like I was alone in the situation. It's just a very weird one-off situation in which I certainly would have been killed. I think. I mean, as far as I can tell, they would have killed me. They certainly seemed totally intent on tearing me to shreds. I've never seen animals that pissed off at nothing. They're just absolutely furious that I dared to exist. Yeah. And so, yeah, anyway, it's just a weird story. I want to be really clear. This is an exact example of part of what we were just talking about. There was literally no planning. Had I made a plan, I'd have died. I didn't have time to do anything, and I didn't react, and I don't know why I didn't react. Normally, I would be terrified. I have no explanation for my lack of behavior. I just sort of absconded from agency and gave it over to the sky or whatever, and the sky, I don't know what the fuck, the dogs were embarrassed. They literally looked embarrassed.
I think it's really interesting to see, on either side. On the dog side, I think there's a great study of the nexus of power and control and fear in there, in their perpetration. On your side, I don't know. People say freeze, fight, or flight or whatever, but I think there's something about intuition here, about the role of the master of the mind. If you don't have fear, if you don't show fear, the dogs don't get the exhibition of control, which is why they were in it in the first place. It's just fascinating.
Well, another thing too is dogs like that, I'm pretty sure every other living being that they've chased like that or came at like that ran from them, like squirrels and stuff.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know if they chase.
Yeah.
And then when they come up to
Not
this
just
guy,
them.
yeah,
not
when they
just
come
them,
up to
every
this
one of their
guy,
ancestors. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, when they come to this guy and he's not budging, they're like, "What the fuck?"
Yeah. But I wish I could take credit. I'd be like, it was my Zen training. I sat a lot of meditation. So, I was just, no, I don't know what the fuck happened. And I wasn't thinking, and I didn't change stance. I was in a relaxed stance when the event began, and I was in the same relaxed, nonchalant stance when it ended. Had I even changed stance, that probably would have been enough. I don't know. It's hard to know what was going on. I am fascinated by what happened. I just want to be really clear. I'm not taking credit for it. I didn't do anything. I didn't not do anything. Here's what I'm trying to say. I made 0 decisions. None. So that's
No plan and no thought.
Yeah.
Being in the moment where all the opportunities are, and the paradox is talking about that is ruining it.
Right, exactly. That's why I keep saying, like, there's nothing happened that I can understand that I did or didn't do. There was no. It was a moment of no action. So it literally, like, some people say, like, oh yeah, you froze. No, I didn't freeze. I was still relaxed, comfortable, nonchalant. It was almost as if, okay, here's one thing I might say. There's a position in awareness that we rarely experience. I've only experienced it once during a strange sleep paralysis moment. And this experience, in this experience, my perspective split into 3 positions. One was the position in my body, my position, the one I'm used to. One was the position above it that was a completely emotionally detached observer, looking down at my body, totally detached. And the third position was some kind of explosion origin thing. And in this case, it's almost as if I went from my body to the second position and just became totally detached. Perhaps that's partly an explanation. I don't know. But anyway, enough of that story. I just want to be clear, like, I didn't do it. I'm alive, but I don't know why. I think those dogs would certainly have killed me had I done anything. But I could be wrong about that too.
Yeah, it sounds like you moved in a way that was counter to the flow of their instincts, and that somehow blew a fuse for a moment.
Mm-hmm. They definitely looked embarrassed.
Right.
They looked like someone who's just been caught pooping their pants, like an adult who's just been caught, like, shitting their pants or something.
Yeah, right. It created a certain asymmetry, I think.
Yeah.
Which was, somewhat paradoxical. So the opposite of running away isn't necessarily running toward. It's
right.
Yeah, like you were saying.
Yeah, it's hilarious. But it really was comical. I'll never forget it. It was one of the weirdest moments of my life. And the thing that made it, if the dogs had just stopped or whatever, it would have been fine. But I got to see the transformation of their face from lethal fury to puzzlement to open confusion to state checking to embarrassment to shame to going home.
It's brilliant. I mean, this is just such a great little vignette.
I thought DB would particularly appreciate it.
I think
and probably have some insight about it too, right?
And so another thing too about that is that situation right there can be, sort of a really good example of a state of being to adopt or emulate or try to achieve when the phantasm of that fictitious idea of death appears. Because I feel like when people have the fear, they're feeding it, basically feeding that idea of fear with or that idea of death with the visceral fear reactions, because ultimately, no one knows, or understands death. Not even me. Like, I feel like talking about it is a paradox. It's like trying to go somewhere where words cannot go. Yeah. Sort of like in dreams and stuff. But yeah, for me, I haven't had the phantasm of death haunt me in a while. Occasionally things will spook me, like a noise, and then I realize, oh, okay, it's just a noise, and I'll calm down. Those sort of visceral reactions still happen, but yeah, the phantasms and nightmares of death no longer really bother me. Yeah, because it does those that fictitious idea of death comes at people like those dogs. Um, yeah, and it'll leave you alone if you don't feed it.
There's also a strong relationship. If you watch nature, right? The humans are lying about what happens in nature. And part of what's causing them to lie this way is a trenchant misinterpretation of Darwin that proposes that nature is red in tooth and claw, and the law, not the law of nature, is survival of the fittest. The laughable array of bullshit. Neither of those things are true, or the degree they might be true, the degree to which they might be true, is quite modest compared to all the other things that are important to acknowledge and see. But if you watch predators, and you don't have to watch them a lot to understand this, you just have to watch them a little bit and you'll see it immediately. They don't pick the healthy, juicy, happy animals to eat. They pick the weak, the sick, the disoriented. There might be occasional exceptions. It's not a law, it's a principle. But by and large, right, the bird that goes and eats an insect, it's the one that's like bumbling around in plain sight, disoriented. That's the one that gets eaten. Doesn't go, finding. I mean, it could. There's probably some of that going on. Mostly what I'm saying, but I think what I'm trying to say is that disorientation, certain kinds of disorientation summon death. And so the fear of death, I'm saying here, is that the fear of death is the kind of disorientation that summons death. It's not the only thing going on. Again, it's a principle, not a law.
Yeah, the red and tooth and claw stuff is a really diminished image of what's actually going on. Like it's sort of like making like 100 photocopies of a really bad digital image.
Yeah, I love that analogy. Lossy compression, right? The reiteration of lossy compression in a concept. This is the primary problem in modern human cognition, our relationships with language, identity, meaning, all these things. This is what has happened, and science and religion and technology are the primary sort of engines that drive and cause that lossy compression. Right? It's like if you took a video of something and you compressed it lossily until you just have like cubes of color, and then you kept compressing that lossily. That's what modern words like tree and cat and food and things, that's what they've become for most of us. They're just these This is partly why we have what Korzybski called oh God, something's wrong with my vocabulary and memory lately. Single valued thoughts or evaluations, right? That is just a tree. Right? This is just that. One valued concepts of identity, meaning, function, and so forth.
Oh yeah, that's really good because I feel like in a lot of ways people have automatically death bad.
Right. Yeah.
And me,
exactly.
I'm like, why?
Yeah.
And then what you said about carnivores in nature, I've seen lots of videos of wolves hunting because it's just fascinating and brilliant. And one of the recent ones I saw was them chasing some elk. And a couple of those elk turned around and started strutting at the wolves, and the wolves just went around them. They're like, nope, not these two. And so
Right.
they completely skirted them and continued chasing the herd because, like you said, they're looking for the sick, wounded, ill, old.
Disoriented.
Yeah, and then in one of these documentaries, they went to incredible lengths to chase an elk through some water, like a river, and they eventually got the elk. And when the biologist came around to examine the carcass long after they finished eating, they found that the cow elk had a massive tumor in her jaw.
Bingo.
And he said that first off, he didn't know how they sensed that, and it's like, well, wolves know, trust me. And then second off, he said, yeah, if they didn't do this, her jaw would have like completely disfigured and she would have starved to death, which would have been a way worse way to go. So
Okay, yeah, this is it's so funny. I guess I was having something of a psychic link with you or something, because this is exactly where I was going to go next. It's not just the creatures that are disoriented, right? Predators often save animals from long, lingering, suffering deaths, right? They sense the animals that are sick or dying, and they come and execute a relatively quick, relatively painless, usually, kill. There are exceptions. Again, it's not a law, it's a principle. But yeah, they save animals from long, lingering deaths by eating them. And this is the other red, the humans are, yeah, red in tooth and claw. No, euthanasic in tooth and claw. Kind of different, those two concepts.
yeah, and another thing too is people with that fear of death, it also prevents people from considering things. There are good ways to die and really shit ways to die.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's so many interesting threads here, I just think the psychology of power and fear exhibited by the dogs in your story is so great. But just to stick on the human side for a minute, right? What's really fascinating to me is this impulse to plan. As you said, if you'd had a plan, it would have been wrong and you would have been eaten, right?
Most likely.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that's fascinating. The plan to defend yourself, the plan to run, all of these things seem to, feed the dogs your fear, which is why you're not dog food to them. Dog food comes out of a can or a bag. They're in
Yeah,
it.
they weren't attacking me to eat me.
I know, right? They're in it for every hand that's ever struck them.
Mm-hmm.
They're in it for the power over the other, You're not food, you're the object of their power, right? And so your planned reaction, you would plan based on fear, which brings you subject to them, brings you under their control. Just having a plan brings you under their control. And what's really interesting too is the way that fear leads to the plan, which is a hedge against the future and the unknown, all prevents you from being in the moment. and being appropriate. And I'm not giving you credit for doing the appropriate thing consciously at all, you know, as you were saying.
Yeah, I reject that.
But isn't
I'm
it
just rejecting
interesting,
that.
you know, that your openness to the moment in this case, you know, the fact of being without a plan, you know, a hedge against fear resulted in this situation. And I think what's really interesting about the idea of the plan too. So you said, and I agree that we have this kind of one-dimensional thinking, right? We categorize, and in that categorize, fail to understand the reality before us. Whatever we put in the box does not fit in the box. We put in the box as an efficiency or a fear-based simplicity. So we put the dogs in the box, you know, or we put the response in a box. And a plan is a cascading series of these misconceptions, of these misperceptions. And, you know, largely they are right. That's why we do them largely. And largely they have some kind of function based on some kind of goal. But the act of planning here first misperceives the situation at every step, right? And then the fact that you have a conception of the situation at every step occludes recognition of what other possibilities may be available to you. And the whole act itself, again, at every step, presumes a goal that you may not hold in that moment. And there's just a cascading tower of attachments to errors throughout the whole idea of this plan against the dogs, you know, and it's just fascinating.
Okay, so there's something. Oh yeah. Okay, I see now. I almost lost the thread. Okay. There are different ways to build objects. Say I want to build a bed frame. Okay. Now, if I'm very creative and playful, and I'm an artist about it, I could build it through experiment, right? I could decide I'm not going to have a plan. I'm going to discover how to build my bed frame while I'm engaged in the process of building it, much the way that Darren does when I compose music usually. It's without a plan. I approach the instrument, a relationship ensues. Similarly with writing. But sometimes I do have a bit of a plan with writing. I've got an idea that I want to elucidate. But my point here is that there are certain kinds of activities for which planning is appropriate. If you're going to build something out of metal and there's a series of steps involved to ensure that the parts fit together when you're done and you don't just destroy all the previous steps by making a single mistake late in the process. For that kind of thing, planning is powerful and useful. The problem is that we transfer the usefulness and the importance of that onto things that have nothing to do with it because they are not engineering tasks. That's part of, okay, I made the mistake of single valued thinking when I used the word the. The is the word of single valued, right? The problem, that means there's one problem. The way, that means there's one way. A problem, a way, this is the difference between a and the. So a problem, that is a problem when we do that. And it's a natural thing to do because the products of engineering are very compelling. Look at a guitar or a piano or a wristwatch, the old kind, but even the new kind, right? You're not going to assemble an integrated circuit planlessly. Good luck. The problem is that those accomplishments are so compelling that we might be inclined to transfer that compulsion from engineering to any other act and think, wow, you know, those people did something. They built a fucking zipper. Have you ever looked at a zipper? Could you build a zipper? A zipper is an insane thing. I mean, simple things are insane. I have no idea how to make most of the things that surround me in my life. I mean, even a book, a cassette tape? Are you fucking kidding me? How could you possibly record sound on a piece of fucking tape? That doesn't make any sense. I have no idea how the fuck that works. No idea. I'm sure someone could explain it to me. It just seems impossible to me. How could you even come up with an idea that would allow you to encode sound on a piece of tape? It really seems impossible to my thinking mind. I have no idea how that works. Similarly, television, no fucking clue. No clue. I mean, computers seem somewhat less impressive to me than things like the invention of radio or television signals or, like tape recordings, or LP records. Mostly that stuff actually seems impossible to me. I mean, I'm singing a long, dissertation here about things that look nuts to me. But my point is just that, I'm sorry to have belabored it so badly. My point is that we see the impossible prowess of stepwise engineering processes. The mistake is that we think that if we just do the same thing, for example, in a relational situation, or perhaps a transactional situation, we will achieve the same perfection and continuity of result over time and over possibility space. And that is a misperception, though it isn't always a misperception. If your goal is to manipulate human thoughts, feelings, and relationships, you can definitely learn principles, not necessarily plans, but you can use principles that ordinary people are extremely vulnerable to, and they will produce consistent results. It's true. You can prime them. You can manipulate them.
Yeah, this is lovely stuff. It reminds me of the conversations, George at least has mentioned about armoring and technology, and it reminds me of the circuit too. Everything you've said is very well received, and I agree. And I think there's an interesting difference I want to draw. In the sense that when you said, and how would you engineer an integrated circuit? I mean, I totally agree. And I'm surrounded by technical artifacts that, are so clever. It's just astounding, And I think it's really interesting too, the fact that you said if it's made of metal, if it's dead, if it's predictable, if it's static, we can build a world out of those things through this approach of the engineering plan. We can build the integrated circuit that you meant out of dead things with an integrated plan. But when you said, how does one even build an integrated circuit? My mind leapt and it went straight to, I do every day. I build an integrated circuit with my garden, or I build an integrated circuit with my cat. And it's not the type that you were referring to, but I think it's notable in the sense that the feedback loops between living things automatically assemble themselves if they approach it in that way. They automatically, just by being integrity, just by listening and doing the feedback, they create the resonance that allows them to diversify, explode, and expand. If we're not dealing only with dead things, with static things, with predictable things. Mm-hmm. And that turn in the path, that left or right there is really, I think it's a lot of the content that we talk about. It's fascinating.
I guess I'm hesitant to acknowledge the similarity between what I think of as an integrated circuit and a symbiotic. It seems that what the creatures do together is very different than an integrated circuit, though it maximizes a variety of what we could think of as benefits and protections. Definitely maximizes. I mean,
I agree, and yeah, please say more.
Yeah, my impression of living systems is wildly like there's nothing that impresses me. I've said, similar things before. Things like the entire history of human technological development is unequal to 12 seconds of the activity inside an ant. Right? Which is my actual perspective. It sounds like wild hyperbole. No, it's not. Those living creatures, they are doing wildly impossible things moment to moment, second to second. There is no chance ever of technology equaling the slightest of their successes. But humans don't think this way, generally. They dismiss the miracles of biorelational integrity and hyperfunction, and they sing the praises of technological what they call advancement, which is hilarious because mostly it's just the advancement of death. There are very few technological advancements that don't take their success from mass obliteration of biology. Almost all of them.
And
Go ahead.
I mean, you said that it seems astounding to say that. I couldn't be more with you the whole way, and it stems from studying biochem and all that. I mean, it's marvelous beyond words. It can't even be expressed how complex and in concert it is. It's as if, we were talking earlier about the plan versus the no plan. And it reminds me of the carefully written symphony versus jazz. And the thing about jazz is they can play beyond a symphony.
Yeah, I mean, there's something even weirder. And again, most of the things that I think we really would benefit from paying careful attention to, they're invisible to us for a really trippy reason. So you were talking about the difference between a symphony and jazz, right? And how jazz can exceed what a symphony does, if I was understanding you correctly. Was I reading you right?
That's correct.
Okay,
and the
great.
thing that I wanted to say is the plan, the engineered artifact, is a simplified, thin facsimile of what can be produced in the other system.
Yes. Now, here's what I want to point at. This is what you've given me to see correctly, which is that, when George was here, I was giving him a recording of my morning prayers, and there's a phase in those prayers where I acknowledge the directions, and I realize I'm belaboring this a bit, but it's okay. I'll get over it at some point. And what I say is the 4, 8, 10, 26, and 27th directions. And George was like, what are you doing? What do you mean 27 directions? And I explained that there's a thing that comes before the symphony and the jazz. And what that thing is the possibility of there being directions at all. That's the 27th direction, right? The possibility of there being either jazz or orchestra, that thing is what the organisms are producing. And that thing supervenes over all specific expressions, vastly supervenes, right? So impossibly it's really hard to value this thing because it's kind of invisible, whereas the jazz, we can actually taste it. But the potential for there to be music at all catastrophically supervenes over any instance of music. Does that make any sense?
You remind me of the shortcomings of large language model AI. It can never, it's a paltry reflection. It could never create the space or the range or the depth.
Right.
That's where I go with what you said. Yeah.
Yeah. I just want us to acknowledge that what the organisms are doing is very insanely astonishing. They're literally producing the possibility space within which the stuff that we acknowledge arises. And that part's kind of invisible to us. But I think it can become visible when we acknowledge it. I've never heard anyone acknowledge the feature of directionality, which is the possibility of there being directionality. Right? People might be like, yeah, north, west, south, east, okay. But they don't see the fundamental thing, yeah, which is that which creates the possibility of even having the discussion at all.
The Tao begins.
Yes.
There was the
origin.
one.
Yeah, origin. But yes, I agree about the jazz and the the jazz and the orchestra. And the orchestra is the model of planning, right? And the jazz is the model of presence, I think. Presence in improv and play.
Right. Yeah, I think invisibility is probably related to feedback. So invisibility is actually a property of perception itself, insofar as perception itself involves feedback. Um, but the invisible can become visible through feedback, I suppose. So.
Say more.
Am I on the right track, George, when I say that, the seen can only be seen because there is the unseen as well?
Yeah, in a certain sense, yeah. So ordinarily, when we perceive our environment, we already find ourselves with some kind of product, but the process by which the product appears is usually transparent or invisible. But the invisibility of that process can be augmented through feedback. So, in other words, the very process by which you perceive your environment can become a percept. Ordinarily, it's dormant, but yeah, you can actually transform it into a percept through feedback. So you end up seeing an aspect of your own body, which is ordinarily a process, as a product in the external world. So, yeah, I think organisms are engaged in that kind of feedback process in general. So, yeah. So meditation, I think, can make that plain. You can become aware of the extent to which your everyday awareness is already a kind of feedback loop. And that feedback loop, I think, is what you meant by a circuit when you were talking about integrated circuits and their relationship to life.
some sort of magic to start to realize the process of realization.
Right. I mean, I
Could
mentioned,
you be a little more tricky there, please?
well, I've mentioned before how plants really seem to embody something about space as such. So you can use plants to understand the nature of space, precisely because they seem to lack this kind of relation between center and circumference that other living things exhibit. So you can by peering into a plant, you can perceive something, I think, about both light and space. And that kind of perception, or that appearance, is, I think, a form of feedback. I guess that's what I'm saying more generally. But that feedback reoccurs, it reappears within consciousness, it reappears within perception. So the very same mechanism by which you can render the process of awareness as a percept appears morphologically in the form of a living thing in space. So those, basically, consciousness and the body are two aspects of the same process. I guess that's what I'm saying. So that they're not necessarily distinct. So what you see when you look at your environment is mind. It's some kind of ideal being. So there is no such thing as you having a mind, right? So you don't have a mind. What you perceive in your environment is mind itself. It is your mind. So yeah, so yourself, what you think of as yourself, is really something in your external environment, I think. It's not like an internal private possession. So
Mm-hmm.
that's where feedback really comes into play.
I wonder if this is, helpful or interesting. Something that occurred to me, I was reminded of by that brilliant treatise, was the process, of cephalization. So there was this process where things got ahead, somehow they developed senses, and it's
They
interesting.
got ahead of themselves.
Yeah, I mean, words are interesting, aren't they? um, what does it say about the organism and its environment and the relationship between the two, that it oriented in a direction? That
Yep.
its sensation went in a way about the unit, the thing together. Um, that's fascinating to me.
The container metaphor, possession, these are fundamental deceptions in conceptual language. If you hear in discussions of Zen training and so on, you might hear something like, over time, you wear away. I think I can actually find this. Let me see here. This barrier. Maybe. I'll have to paraphrase it so that I don't spend a long time searching, but something like, over time, mistaken ideas, you grind them away, they turn into dust. Inside, outside, self and other, above, below, all of these things fade away. And then, you awaken to true self-nature, which is no self-nature. Unpossessing. No possessor, no possessed. No inside, no outside. Empty of these characteristics so familiar to us and upon which almost all of our cognition depends.
Right. I think plants really exemplify that in a certain way. I think plants lack either an inside or an outside in a certain respect because they reveal their environment. They're like products of wind and light. Their direction. So I think plants plants are essentially symmetrical beings, almost like the visible spectrum. So to ask what the directionality of a plant is, I think is similar to asking what the directionality of a rainbow is. It's like, well, in a certain respect, it's just a kind of symmetrical entity. It doesn't actually have the kind of direction that an animal does. Because with the animal, you have this kind of more clear localization of a center. So a plant is really losing itself almost in its external environment. It's a kind of cascading series of waves, just like light. So I think there's a very clear symmetry between plants and light in terms of their physical form, at least as we perceive them. Yeah. And I think that
In one
analogy goes pretty
sense,
deep.
they are the between of nothing, something, death, and life. And so they are expressors of each of these seemingly distinct things. They are the enacted embodiment of these matters.
Right.
So it is impossible for them to be separate things, yet humans can easily imagine this way.
Right.
Because language asks us to think like this.
Yeah.
Right?
Culture for sure. I mean, it's and language, yeah, and English in particular, right?
Mm-hmm. That's true.
And I just to build on this, and correct me where I'm wrong, George, but I mean, you can just reveal layers of the truth of what you said, in the idea that the plant that typically presents to us is nothing without its roots. We don't typically see them, but one cannot be without the other. And what's interesting is we see the plant stretch into space. Its roots also stretch into the are typically unknown. It grows as much into the air as it grows into the soil, And in another dimension, the plant is nothing without the carbon dioxide it absorbs. The plant also would die if it could not release the oxygen it emits. It grows internally into itself through these gases that we can't see. But then in this way also, the plant is nothing without the atmosphere. And it turns out, at least for our perception, that the atmosphere is nothing without the plants, because we would not be perceiving it if it weren't, at least. And there's any number of dimensions you can take this along. And it seems to me that, the easiest way for me to think about this, and I don't know, but, there are seams of rock in the crust of the earth, and, according to contemporary science, just the right minerals interface with just the other minerals under the correct temperature and the right pressure such that a crystallization occurs at the edges, the seams. The plant is maybe less a being and more of just where these things come together and form each other. And in that way, so are we. We are host for more microbiota, than civilization had ever previously recognized. We extend into the distal impacts of our actions, and the world makes us as much as we make it. I mean, there's so many dimensions in which this is fascinating.
Yeah. But then when you look at a skyscraper, at least I can see how it really abides by the same kind of principle as something like a stopwatch or a pocket watch, because it only arises by the orchestration of certain components held together or glued together through some kind of extrinsic imposition. And that kind of imposition is pretty fragile. Something like a plant is already integrally whole. So that wholeness, I think, is something that actually stems from the cosmos in a way that a skyscraper approaches from another angle. But over time, I think technical beings, they become more integral. So their components become more integrated or synchronized. So their evolution, I think, can be reconciled with the cosmos, but I think they certainly abide by like an antithetical principle.
Yeah, this is brilliant. I mean, this is the armoring that we were talking about last time too.
Yeah,
And you know, it's fascinating how the skyscraper is fragile in particular ways that the general activity of life is not in any way at all.
exactly.
You know,
Yeah.
in the same kind of comparison anyway.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, not to return directly to the armoring stuff, but you know, yeah, maybe sometime I'll ask more questions.
Yeah, this force appears to be insulating itself or armoring itself against certain kinds of threats, stemming perhaps from us or some other entity. So it's like so it is almost like a living biotic system, I think. Its evolution, I think, is somewhat decoupled at this point from anything like human consciousness, but yeah.
This
And
brings to
maybe
mind.
millennia behind. Sorry, go on. Yeah. Just saying that, you know, the armoring, maybe it approaches time in a different direction, right? As we've talked about, but
Yeah, exactly.
in the way it's so much more simple and fragile than life at this
Exactly.
stage.
So this brings to mind a fundamental problem with modern humans in the context that we have failed to assemble together and are thus subject to. And these contexts pose us as separate individuals. I would ask you to imagine the burdens experienced by a finger separated not merely from the body, but also from the hand. Right? And then imposed upon this finger all of the necessities of agency and capacity that bodies and hands naturally have. Right? And then the finger, in this case, the analogy is a single human being, is punished and rewarded for its ability to either live up to that impossible, I mean, formally impossible projection of agency and responsibility and obligation and so forth. Or to whatever degree it fails to, right, it is discarded and hated and suffers and doesn't get shelter or love or food or whatever. So what I'm getting at here is the tragedy of the skyscraper is that all of its capacities for what resembles resilience, in this case, this equals continuity of structure over time, continuity of structure and location over time, and probably of content, internal and external structure. The entire burden of resilience has to be on that single object, right? Whereas living systems distribute all these things. They distribute vigilance. They distribute prediction. They distribute evaluation of ambiguity. In our culture, that we lose that distributive benefit of living systems is replaced by simulated values and representations that fail completely to accomplish those things. For example, the news. Right? The news does not equip you. Very, very poorly it equips you to make better predictions. It is not the derivation of an intelligent cohort over the possibility space. It is the derivation of the absence of a cohort over the possibility space. And the absence of a cohort affects the possibility space negatively. So it's generating the problems that it pretends to be evaluating. It's fucking devastating. My simple point is that, in approaching a group of sparrows, one day, they distributed their evaluations of me over the cohort. Right? When I turned my head toward them, 3 of them left. Took a step in that direction, 7 more left. Another step, 15 more. Another step, 3 more. Now closing in on them. There are 4 on the ground. They watch me vigilantly and don't leave. So when we are isolated, we have to take on the entire vigilance burden that would ordinarily be taken on shared by our cohort. And similarly, we lose the benefits of inherited resilience. Noticing this, we can establish cohorts that ameliorate that problem. Not noticing this, we remain subject to it. Obviously, individuals are going to be absolutely terrified of death. They're not inheriting any resilience benefit from the cohorts around them. I mean, a little bit. We have hospitals or whatever, right? Okay, I'll grant that. But yeah, just notice the principle that I'm getting at here. Intelligent cohorts distribute the vigilance burden. They distribute the analysis of ambiguity. They distribute the prediction burden. Without intelligent cohorts, you got to do that shit yourself. If you have to do all that yourself, you're going to naturally be frightened. You're being called to do something that no organism should ever have to do. And the reason that you're having to do that is that you live in a representational layer of fictions. Illustrative fictions, representations of relationships, value, resilience, all these things. So that thus deprive you of the actual benefits of the things represented, which you then must be, then you're going to have to purchase them. Right? If you can see this, then, and you can show this to people and teach these principles to children, they will naturally assemble cohorts that are real. You can teach them how to do it if they're confused. It's a small group endeavor. You can accomplish it very quickly. There are a variety of principles like this that I collect under the rubric of cognitive activism. But in another sense, it's not cognitive activism, it's relational activism.
Vervaeke describes this as the participatory knowing that that has been destroyed, has been taken from us. It reminds me a little bit, just hearkening back to our conversation of the symphony and jazz, where living healthy organisms live just merely within natural law and do as thou wilt. And what's interesting is the statistical robustness of that shakes out from within their activity naturally. They don't really have to make any studies. They don't have to develop any plans. It sorts itself out. And it's interesting to me that the symphony or the skyscraper or the bridge approach in the other direction. Naturally, it doesn't do anything. It has to be very carefully armored, very carefully considered, very statistically checked, And, I don't want to drive the conversation this way necessarily or in haste, but what's really interesting to me is we've discussed the nature of the system of the, the planning, the the indebtening of these relationships, these situations around us. And what's really fascinating is the planet, which is our heritage, the reality, which is our heritage, was a great weaving, a great enmeshing, a great connecting of all things. And it's notable. I think it's really interesting how technical objects, represent the hedge against that, the unraveling of that, the separation of those elements into armored individual techniques or devices. But, like capitalism is that. Civilization is that. It is the unraveling of the ravel, right? And it's, I guess it's merely just a hedge, against what is, but, I worry it's more. I don't know. It's interesting. I don't know if that brings up anything in anyone.
Yeah, well, in the technical artifact, the integration becomes more concentrated as an object, I think, as Darren was saying. So that concentration, I think, is important to see because it aligns with what I was saying earlier about the nature of the mind. So in other words, the integration, which ordinarily occurs as a process, is now becoming a kind of object or a kind of product. I just find that kind of interesting because what actually distinguishes these forms of being is something like time. So the mode of being of a plant is distinguished from the mode of being of a skyscraper in terms of something like time. There's a temporal distinction.
And I think you said that beautifully, correct me if I'm wrong, in that every technical object is a host of forgettings, a host
Right,
of
yeah.
lost processes.
Right. Yeah. But I think that forgetting is a kind of echo of a more general process that also occurs in living things. It's like an analog, like a mirror image.
Something I'd like to
it takes place in the mind.
Something I'd like to point out here. This transformation into product, it transfers continuity of structure over time. No, actually, I've got that backwards. It transfers continuity of relationship over time into dead structure over time. And so it transfers the expectation of relation into what can be perceived as non-dying, immortal, right? That structure over time is represented as immortal. You buy the car, it's immortal. You buy the house, it's immortal. It will outlast you. So it transfers the benefit of relational integrity over time into the deathless expectation of structural continuity. Reliable, absence of ambiguity, no need for predictions, turns down the volume on vigilance dramatically, doesn't eliminate it, but turns it way down. It's very important to notice this exchange. It helps us to see what the fuck is actually going on here and why it's so successful. Right? It's successful because it takes care, it pretends to take care of the problem of death that exists in a bad fiction about death, right? It pretends to take care of that and brush it aside with reliable structural continuity over time.
Yeah, and what is the gift? I was thinking of this earlier, and because I think this ties deeply into our entire conversation. But if a rose took our approach, how would that go?
Be made of metal.
I mean, it would never bloom, right? Because to hazard the bloom, reduces its reserves.
Yeah.
It would put its energy into its root, into its stability alone. Its fear of death would preclude it from ever flourishing.
No bird would ever fly.
Yep. Uh-huh.
That's way too fucking dangerous. What you want is a rock cave, right? And just protect that opening, baby. Don't let nothing near that opening.
And when the bird, the bird that never pollinates, when it dies, as it will, of course it takes all that with it, right? It did not reproduce its gift. It did not reinforce the life of which it was.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, I think maybe the idea that death is at the end of some process is incomplete or mistaken.
Oh no, it's wrong.
Yeah.
It's wrong.
You can see that in a rose, as you were saying.
Yeah, there's all kinds of crazy things going on here with death that we're just not, what's the right word? We are not paying careful attention to. This idea I had a few weeks ago that I think is very compelling, and it's a toy. I'm not saying it's what's going on, but I think it's a very important toy to entertain. And it goes like this. All of your intelligences, your urgency to learn, your desire for experience and relation and novelty and food and sleep and dreaming and love, and all that you find affine, right? All that you are drawn to, and all that you despise and turn away from, right? Affinity and disaffinity, or there's a better word for disaffinity, but all of these things, imagine that what you're using to feel, to navigate the sort of magnetic compass within you that draws you to this and makes you object and draws you away from that, and all of these things, that these are death leaking back into your current moment of life. So that actually everything that you desire and everything you avoid, the intelligences that orient those experiences of your interiority are actually from after this life. They are death's intelligences. They are the knowledge you will have when your soul is outside of linear time. They are your death speaking back into your life. So therefore, this goes back to that thing where I was talking about what potentiates the possibility of music as being more interesting than music itself. This is the same kind of thing, because what potentiates the possibility of this being desirable or good is the thing you most avoid. Death. From this perspective. Which again, I present as a toy. I'm not saying this is what I think is true, but it's a very interesting way of playing with perspective. And I think probably has some value or truth. It might even be very true. I just don't know. I have no way to tell. So I present
at
it
the
as a
very
toy.
least, the fear of death, at minimum, right?
Right. And we don't even have to really call it a fear. We should call it a concern. Many great sages, particularly comes to mind Don Juan, a probably fictional but not necessarily fictional sage from the Castanedan writings. They talk at length about keeping the fear of death present in awareness, keeping the awareness of death present in your mind in every moment of your life. Yeah. Using it as an intelligence, right? Make of it a symbiotic satellite intelligence. Yeah. Treat it as a being whose intelligence is your companion. Now, obviously, if we took death very seriously, and rather than fearing it, listened to it. Right? Most of what we do, we would not do. Our orientation would be very fucking different. We would not value the things we value. We would not avoid many of the things we avoid. We would prioritize what we listen to and what we don't very differently. All of these things, I think. And eventually in life, you know, we have different experiences of our expectations of mortality and immortality in different life phases. You know, in my phase, it has become very obvious that I will die, and, you know, relatively soon, possibly very soon. It's unclear when, but it's like when I was young, I was aware that death existed, but life seemed effectively eternal. I knew very few people who had died. Now I know many people who have died. My health is clearly not robust. I'm just aware, right, of the proximity of death. And part of what that makes me desire is not necessarily, and I see this in some of my friends as well, particularly the more desperate their life situation, the more what I'm about to propose becomes troublingly clear. They're looking for a way, particularly the men, they're looking for a way to exit that is meaningful. They don't want to die deprived of their liberties. Right? So they're looking for a way out that's meaningful. They're looking for a place to make a last stand, so to speak. I'm not particularly that way, but I do recognize the difference between protecting something too long so that its assets are not reinvested in the living world. Right? This is weirdly what we mean by leave a legacy or something. But which kind of legacy do you leave? A representational one? You're an author or an actor? You leave films? Or you're the guy that dies saving children? I know this doctor, he works in Germany. He's a young guy, makes a lot of money. I met him on Xbox playing games. And twice a month, he gets in a helicopter with some EMTs, surgeons, and psychologists and goes directly to some site where people are just being obliterated by whatever. Floods, war. They just go there and they do on-site triage. And, he's risking his life every time he gets in that copter. He's also a neurosurgeon. He has like 3 specializations, which is extremely uncommon in especially young doctors. But the other thing he does is he lives very frugally, and he gives most of the money he makes to his patients so they can pay for the medical procedures that they have to undergo. Now, of course, this is all according to his report. I haven't seen this, but the stories he tells about what happens in the helicopter and stuff are very difficult to imagine having been concocted. It's not impossible, but it seems unlikely. So yeah, this is the kind of guy who, he's not writing a book, right? He's not making a movie. He's not, doesn't have 17 albums that became solid gold. Not that those are necessarily without value, but the giving of one's existence for the survival and well-being of others. That's a pretty profound thing, and it's different from making representational artifacts and art and things. I mean, I love art, don't get me wrong. These are just 2 different sort of motivations, if you will. Radically different.
It's really notable and interesting how much this culture focuses on the representational versions of what you described, right? There's
Yeah.
there's something in there's a hint of something interesting on that direction. But you know what's also interesting to me is that my body will be consumed by the organisms of the earth, one way or another. You know, my waste is consumed by the organisms of the earth, one way or another. And the interesting question to me there, in terms of legacy, how fully, you know, do you reciprocate the relationships? You know, how deeply do you give back to what gave you, you know, not in forms of cognition necessarily, but if we're of these relationships and not the deadening of interactions, then it's interesting and notable, you know, how deeply we resonate with that. What is our life's gift? Back to the tomato plant, which gave me its life's gift, you know? How truly do you live?
You know, one of the commitments I made when I was given, and I do feel I was given it, perhaps at great cost, I'm not sure, the capacity for insight far beyond anything I had previously experienced. You know, I made a sort of oath, which was I would remember I would be loyal to and remember all the beings who came before me and would come after, all the different layers of being and time and space. And I would sing to the humans their praises and try to awaken the possibility of anamnesis, like unforgetting in my people. I didn't do that because it was requested of me. I did it because I couldn't help it. I fell in love with everything. I was already in love with everything alive. But during these experiences, I fell in love with their origins and natures and things I'd never seen into before. And I'm not trying to claim that that this behavior in me is somehow heroic or something like that. That would be stupid and ironic. I mean, that would in some ways obviate any intrinsic virtue that might exist in there. I'm just saying I can't help it. It's how I am made to be this way.
Well, in that way, I think you're in good company among all living things.
Yeah, I mean, they must want the humans to wake up because whatever the fuck is going on in our species, something's gone horribly sideways as far as I can tell.
Probably, hopefully temporary. I mean, it is really fascinating that, you know, and this is probably obvious, but, you know, as you were saying, the pledge you made is somehow aligned with all of those things that give us earthly pleasure, you know, um, all of our connections, all of our relationships, all of the tension, all of the textures, all of the scents, all of the drives, all of the truest desires, you know, not the you know, not the desire of someone who wants more than they can have, but all the people who, all the things who appreciate what comes to them. All of those desires are aligned in giving back to the whole.
These urgencies, I would suggest, are inborn in all beings. And they are uniquely inborn in humans. But in humans, very strangely and suspiciously and kind of supernaturally, they are diminished, inhibited, amputated, circumcised, punished, deformed, tortured, lied about. I mean, it's really very suspicious if we look carefully here at the humans. It's obvious like something extremely weird and unexpected is going on. And I'm very curious about that because those urgencies never died in my heart. So,
One thing that's, you know, in all my conversations with George, I think he probably, you know, I'm always kind of scraping and groping to find that thing too, you know, just as you said, you know, what's weird here? What went wrong? But one thing you know, I'm curious how anyone would react to this. You know, the way it works is there's a hedge against all things. You know, we have a role here. We have an ancient purpose and the knowledge and skill set to do it, frankly. I mean, you know, as you said, isn't it just incredible? We have hands. You know, our apparatus is not the mode that allows us to navigate. You know, it's not the claws that allow us to consume. It's the hands for making, the hands for building, you know, and that's really interesting, and rare. And, you know, I do think that is what we did for a very, very, very long time, just taking the contemporary view of science and, you know, thinking back to the enormous amount of time humans were here before history, you know, the civilization's history. But at some point, you know, a new factor arises. Just like every successful species gets a disease, every successful species gets a predator. We somehow internally, you know, discovered the capacity, the resources, we got the power, and we're successful enough that now there's a hedge arising even against us, you know, us being life on this planet. I feel like I take some solace in the idea that these technical inventions are fragile and life is so much more robust. But we're living in the time of the hedge against life, you know, which is, yeah, really, really surprising and interesting. And maybe we are the hedge within that hedge, you know?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I was recently delving into human origins, which I think is a related subject. But yeah, the idea that nature is red in tooth and claw is so pervasive in our approach to life, and particularly, you know, human evolution, which is pretty comical. Almost all of our ideas appear to me to be like mostly upside down.
hey,
Exactly upside down, right?
Yeah, that inversion makes me wonder.
It's
I
not
wonder about the
accidentally upside
systematic
down.
nature of it.
Yeah, it's very intentionally upside down. It doesn't seem happenstance.
Right.
Did you say the Socratic nature of it? What did you say?
Oh, the systematic nature of it
Yeah, okay, absolutely.
makes me wonder.
It's, you know, if you I don't know who, if you were some druid, you know, 10,000 years ago and you saw the situation, you know, you saw the robustness and the beauty and the density and, you know, but like you could light a little fire and, you know, one day it would grow to become a very big fire, but that's nowhere in your lifetime. Just like it would be really interesting to be a consciousness to wonder what it would like to be, to have existence. It might have been interesting to have existence and wonder what it would like to be to destroy it.
Sure. Yeah, but I think as Darren was saying, perhaps we should overcome the notion that life is something that we possess in the same way that I was saying earlier that maybe we should overcome the idea that minds are possessions. We have minds. Yeah, I think that's a source of confusion. There's a connection there, I think.
Yep. It's a co-having. It's a being.
Yeah. Like,
Not a
even within
possession.
like existentialism, I think they get this wrong. When they think of, like, even Heidegger, when he thinks about how death is like some kind of non-event. So you're living, but you never reach, I'm dead. So death for like the existentialists is some kind of non-being or non-event. I just think it's still too linear. So you still think that you're living. I would say no, that you're not actually doing that in the first place. You're not sort of existing on this, parabolic line or trajectory that's moving towards some terminus. Like, that's not even what's going on in the first place. So I think maybe that's a more helpful frame just to question that. Perhaps death is more integral to life itself than we think. So they're not actually like opposed. They're not at opposite ends of some spectrum. they're actually perhaps identical, or they're coextensive. They coexist. So to
Absolutely
parse
codependent.
is kind of confused.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons I wouldn't define myself as an existentialist, but I worry about some of the ramifications of the movement toward existentialism, particularly these days. One of the ways in which I mean that is that, at least, what little I've been exposed to, or, I don't pretend really to know any philosophy. It seems to me that existentialism has been perceived as carte blanche. Here we are, and it's up to you to make whatever you will of it. I think we have a greater responsibility, actually. I reject that kind of relativism.
Right. Because you still think, if you're sort of in that frame, that your life is your responsibility. Well, no, it's not. It's not yours to begin with. It's like ridiculous.
Yeah, exactly. Nailed it.
Yeah, it's kind of comical. Yeah, but that confusion, I think, is perhaps one of the sources of clinging. The idea that we live, and that living is a kind of state of being, that we depart at some point. Like, I don't know if that's even true, but I think that undergirds some of these, concerns, or some of these impulses. Yeah.
Absolutely. It used to be the two worlds mythology, right? Devalues this reality. The idea of possession and separation, that you were outlining, inherent to existentialism, devalues our relationships in this reality. I don't want this really to depart into terribly new subjects, but there's still something about that armoring and the kind of do you see the technological movement as merely a hedge that must exist within the sphere of life, capital L life? Or do you think that the armoring movement, the technological movement, is a thing unto itself and will supersede life, or somehow, I'm kind of curious what you see as, the dynamics of these forces.
Yeah, I think technical evolution involves the same kind of feedback that takes place in us, in human consciousness, but its evolution is independent of anything that takes place in our own sort of evolutionary trajectory now. So I think feedback is the common element. So basically, feedback explains this process of integration over time, I think, which is a kind of physical process in the body of the technical being. um, that feedback, I think, has a kind of ideal catalyst or point of genesis. So it originated in a kind of symbol, which is like an archetype. I think something similar takes place in a living system, like in our bodies or in something like a tree or an animal. So there's a kind of analogy there, but its relationship to time is, as we mentioned, I think, distinct.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I'm putting it in terms of that feedback of that relationship. I think that connects a lot of dots.
Right. And that was why I was curious to explore with you maybe more thoughts on the future, what you think of maybe thermodynamically in terms of what the future might be or its relationship to entropy. There could be some connection there worth exploring, but in terms of reconciling what actually distinguishes that form of time or that kind of temporality, I might be reluctant to simply say that it's the distinction between the past and the future, but there could be, I think, a deeper connection there. Because, like, if you look at the work of Simondon or Deleuze, they both seemed to indicate that technicity is a kind of movement arising out of the future and percolating into the present, which would make sense of its connection to death in the first place, as Darren was saying, right? If we regard death as a kind of supervening force or mode of existence, like even Heidegger, toward the end of his career, his life, he started to regard technology as a kind of force that was anathema to being. I'm not sure if that's a coherent point of view, but I think it's resonant with the views of Deleuze. So they all seem to be converging on a similar point of view that might contain something worthwhile. And I can see how our own discussion is sort of like broaching that that subject. So I think there's something to it, but I haven't totally fleshed it out. But understanding the energy or the thermodynamic implications would be helpful.
It sure does seem to me, at first blush anyway, that this relationality seems to resolve a lot of that to me anyway, which is great to see. I just, there's this more narrow technical sense of entropy, and I'm not sure all of its premises should be taken for granted as they, exist within kind of contemporary science and whatever blind spots it may have, particularly about the arrow of time and the inexorable increase of entropy no matter what,
Right, that's good. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, one thing that's really interesting to me, of course, is the energy flows, at least as we understand them, which I think also has some limits. But, I don't feel the same kind of concern, as we link the kind of interconnectionality of all things, including technical objects and organisms.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I mean, I really, you get down into the, the biochemistry of it all, and it's just amazing to see like how, machines is how beautiful of a machine we all are. And that's even kind of an insult, frankly. It's beyond that, but it's common parlance. So, but I don't know. These kind of ultimate questions that you were mentioning with Heidegger and it's brilliant stuff. I really love kind of indulging in it, but thinking about all things, and I think so much of your physics kind of relates to this, thinking about all things and their connections, that is, a better way to understand reality is the reality of those connections, of course, not their individualism. And I think that really it goes a long ways toward banishing that sort of outlook of separation and causation and ultimate finality of any sort. But I don't know.
Right. Well, no, I mean, that's good to hear because the whole idea that the universe is simply winding down through entropy seems pretty suspect to me. I mean, it only makes
I
sense
agree.
if you imagine that the universe is like a box with gas in it that slowly sort of fills the box and loses order or becomes more chaotic. But I really just doubt that the universe is anything like a box or anything like a container. Just it doesn't make any sense to me. And I think it would only make sense in those terms. So, like, if you imagine that the universe is like a shoebox with things moving around, then over time you might imagine that the sort of maybe the orderliness of the situation within the box would decrease over time. But yeah, I really just don't buy the whole notion that the universe is anything like a spatial.
Wings are just hammers with feathers on them. Those are just factories with some meat painted on.
Right, right.
Everybody knows this. Yeah, obviously.
And yeah, it's it finds its own assumptions, right? Like it determines what it was based upon when it set out, which is really interesting. And it occurs to me in a similar way that Newtonian mechanics is maybe a helpful back of the napkin kind of ballpark guesstimate that apparently can put people on the moon, whatever that even means. That's interesting and notable, and perhaps there's a set within which these quote unquote laws of thermodynamics were determined, right? But I think it's become apparent even in mainstream science that there's some just enormous blind spots and likely some massive misunderstandings, misconceptions. And I think it comes down to even the thermodynamic defiance of photosynthesis, which I think I've mentioned on a previous call at some point. There's some kind of magic in there that we don't that contemporary science does not understand at all. And yet energy flows is a thing too, which is independently fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Guys, I got to roll for now. George, I'd be grateful if you send me a link to the recording. I'd like to post it if no one objects.
Oh, sure. Should I stop it now or?
No, not by any stretch of the imagination. I'm gonna sign off for now, but I love you guys. You're amazing. It's so great to have these conversations. It's it's the opposite of church. I love it.
Yes, rejuvenating.
So yeah, all blessings to you, and until next time.
All right, Darren. Love you. See you.
Peace.
Cheers.
Love you too. Yeah.
If you have anything on the tip of your tongue, that would be great. But I just love to pick this up maybe at another time. I may have some things, but there's a lot of leads for good future conversation.
Yeah, certainly. Let's delve into that later.
Well, cheers. I hope you're well and stay well.
Yeah, thanks. You too. I'll see you soon.
Sounds great. I hope so. Bye.